I think we'll start because time is ticking, right? And our first presenter is Rebecca Stanton of Columbia University. Please.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So, hi everybody. Thank you for having me. In the past year and change, right, we've actually lost two members of our family in the Columbia Slavic department. Catharine Nepomnyashchy, whom we celebrate today, and also Frank Miller, who will be officially memorialized in the fall, as I understand it. But I wanted to say that my remarks today owe a debt that I think is visible both to Kathy and to Frank, as well as to an important event whose 55th anniversary will be celebrated this coming Tuesday, Yuri Gagarin's pioneering space flight in 1961, heralded by Soviet propagandists as a fairy tale come true. This paper, by the way, was originally scheduled to be given on a panel in 2011 that came into being at Kathy's instigation. And in typical Kathy style, she called me on the day of the ADSEAL deadline and said, I want to do a panel. I think I'm going to talk about Nabokov. What have you got? Can you get in touch with Rebecca Pyatkevich and Margot Rosen and find out what they're working on and see if we can find a common theme? So, Rebecca and Margot and I exchanged a whole bunch of emails. And as it ended up, both the Rebeccas sort of folded, and Rebecca Pyatkevich very sensibly sort of retreated from giving a paper and installed herself as chair. And I, on the day of the panel, threw up my hands and installed myself as an instant discussant. So this material has actually never seen the light of day. But it was very much inspired by, it was given its first impulse by Kathy's emergency summons. As Frank Miller notes in his monograph, Folklore for Stalin, Soviet culture enjoyed something of a contradictory, even paradoxical relationship with Russian fairy tales. On the one hand, the proletarian organizations that seized control of literature in the late 1920s found that the Strugatsky, along with folklore in general, were ideologically backward and a harmful survival of the past, and waged a campaign against them as such. On the other hand, leading folklore scholars and writers argued that folklore represented the oral poetic creations of the broad folk masses, whose fundamental meaning was the striving, this is all basically quotations from Frank's text, the oral poetic creations of the masses whose fundamental meaning was the striving of primitive working men to ease their own labor and to increase its productivity. In short, that the Strugatsky and other folk narratives belonged to the working classes and should be celebrated as a genuine art of the people. A further point in favor of the skazka as a Soviet genre was Roman Jakobson's observation that, quote, a fairy tale performs the role of a social utopia. It is a dream about the conquest of nature, about a magic world where, at the pike's command, at my own request, all the pails will by themselves go up the hill. This dream of a world where productivity would be enhanced, even as the worker's life was eased, obviously coincided with the ambitions of socialism, and the fairy tale's combined technique of embodying and enforcing shared values while offering the infallible promise of a happy ending made it arguably a kind of literary parallel to the socialist political project. The popular slogan, "We were born to make fairy tales come true," oops, this is where my arrow keys, there we go. "We were born to make fairy tales come true," taken from the first line of the popular 1920 song, the Aviators March, later adopted as the official anthem of the Soviet Air Force, then adopted by Stalin, and subsequently reassociated with the Soviet space program in propaganda materials such as this poster. These images turned the temporal structure of the fairy tale upside down, beckoning the audience not backward into an immemorial past, but forward into what we might call an immemorial future. The implications of this collision of two time streams, the ahistorical past of the skazka and the utopian future of Soviet ambitions in the cosmos, are explored by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky in their revolutionary fairy tale, Monday Begins on Saturday, Понедельник начинается в субботу. Published at the height of the space race in 1965, Monday Begins on Saturday deploys the magical furnishings of the Russian folktale, as well as its most celebrated literary adaptations by Alexander Pushkin and others, to satirize the institutional organization of Soviet cosmonautics and Soviet science in general, as well as many other aspects of Soviet byt. The action takes place at the Научно-исследовательский институт чародейства и волшебства, or Ничего. Ничего is located near the northern city of Solovets, ineluctably evoking the site of the Soviet Union's first labor camp. This is not a coincidence. The Institute also shares a number of other features in common with both the labor camps immortalized a few years earlier in Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and the industrial cities immortalized by Valentin Kataev in Time Forward, which David spoke about. Where is David? There he is. Which David Goldfarb so eloquently spoke about in today's first session. And of course, it was Kathy herself who brilliantly anatomized the isomorphism between those two Soviet model institutions, right? The labor camp and the industrial city. In her 2003 paper entitled Kataev's Time Forward and Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is preserved in her famous Kataev file that David alluded to, and has since become a cornerstone of my teaching of both novels. One of the features that Nichevo shares with both the labor camp of Solzhenitsyn's Ivan Denisovich and the industrial city of Kataev's David Margulis is the manipulation of time, captured in the novel's title, Monday Begins on Saturday. The wording of the title suggests the span of days traditionally comprising the working week, Monday through Saturday, omitting Sunday, the traditional day of rest. Here, one can't help but think of the news that Ivan Denisovich finds out while waiting in line for a package, right? Once again, there wasn't going to be a Sunday this week. Once again, they were going to steal one of their Sundays, right? The they being the authorities who had the ability to excise Sunday from the calendar in this way. The title, Monday Begins on Saturday, thus contrives to satirize the Soviet procedure of rearranging the calendar for maximum productivity, skipping Sunday's day of rest altogether, even as it also suggests the workers' reaction against this procedure, i.e. goofing off on Monday as if it were Saturday. And this is just one of the many ways in which this text engages and plays with the various time conventions of the fairy tale, the science fiction narrative, the political calendar, and so on. My students had a ton of fun identifying all of the different discourses of time that are sort of played around with in the novel, but which sadly I don't have time to go into right now. Officially, however, the title of the novel turns out to be a literal description of the story's timeline as experienced by the Institute's director, Janus Poluektovich Nevstruyev. Nevstruyev, whose seeming combination of scientific brilliance and incredible forgetfulness confounds the magical researchers working under him at Nichevo, turns out to be both the discoverer and the victim of a complicated theory called discontinuous temporal countermotion. Within each 24-hour period, he lives in a forward direction like everyone else. But at midnight, instead of moving forward into the following day with everyone else, he skips back into the first moments of the preceding day. Everyone else's Monday thus begins at the same moment as Nevstruyev's Saturday. That is, it's the second right after midnight on Sunday, right? The omission or suppression of Sunday from the novel's title is also reflected in the action of the novel, which is divided into 3 parts, collectively covering all the days of the week except Sunday. Part 1 of the Strugatsky's Sundayless narrative begins on Thursday, April 26, 1962, and ends on Saturday, April 28th. Part 2 begins on Monday, right? So the previous part ends on a Saturday. Part 2 begins on Monday, December 31st, 1962, and ends on Tuesday, January 1st. Part 3 begins on Wednesday, April 10th, 1963, and ends on Friday, April 12th, 1963, the second anniversary of Gagarin's spaceflight, which goes completely unmentioned in the Strugatsky's narrative, but obviously forms an expected part of the cultural baggage that the reader brings to bear, both on the novel's play with Soviet slogans about making fairy tales come true, right, and on its depictions of pointless and disappointing space travel. Although they actually literally work on projects designed to make fairy tales come true, the сотрудники at Nichevo are not particularly interested in space travel. Time travel is much more their cup of tea. Although they have yet to achieve true time travel, one researcher has managed to build a motorbike that enables the writer to travel into the, quote, described future i.e. the future of human civilization as adumbrated in the writings of utopian authors from antiquity to the present day. When the protagonist, as you can imagine, there's quite a few gaps, and also quite a lot of repetition. When the protagonist, Sashka Privalov, journeys into the future on this motorbike, he sees cosmonauts boarding spaceships bound for distant planets, while their girlfriends enter a giant refrigerator to wait on ice for their expected return some centuries later. So this is one of the ways that the Strugatskys kind of show that space travel and time travel are sort of necessary companions, right? Because what are the girlfriends going to do for the hundreds of years while their boyfriends are going to Mars, right? Anyway, speeding ahead to the age of returns, Privalov witnesses rusty spaceships, okay, thanks, Irina, lurching back to Earth and disgorging crippled, broken men who immediately start exhorting, quote, every last member of the human race to fly to the planet of willy-nilly in the EOLS star system of the Lesser Magellan Nebula to liberate their brothers in reason who are groaning under the yoke of a bloodthirsty cybernetic dictator, unquote. An obvious and hilarious inversion of Soviet aspirations to conquer the cosmos. But the key episode of space travel in Monday Begins on Saturday is undertaken not by cosmonauts departing from Earth, but by extraterrestrial visitors to Earth. These aliens serve as the novel's archetypical example of its central invention, discontinuous temporal countermotion. According to the theory advanced by Privalov's colleague, Roman Oira, the 1908 Tunguska explosion, generally attributed to a meteor, was actually caused by the landing of this alien spaceship. But the reason that the spaceship itself was never found is that the aliens inside were discontinuous countermovers. Having landed in the taiga, setting it on fire, on June 30th, 1908, at midnight on that day, they and their spaceship moved not forward into July 1st, but backward into June 29th, in exactly the same way as the Institute's director, Nevstruyev. At some point later on their timeline, but earlier on Earth's timeline, the aliens took off again, so the spaceship was gone from Earth before it ever landed. But what's interesting here is the reason that Oira posits for the aliens' strange relationship to Earth time. He says, these were not the simple artless aliens of science fiction novels. They were countermovers, comrades, people who had come to our world from a different universe in which time flows against ours. The interaction of the opposed time streams transformed them from ordinary countermovers who saw our universe like a film projected backwards into discrete countermovers. In other words, it is precisely the interactions of two contrary temporal impulses. I'm on my last paragraph. One moving forwards and the other backwards, that produces the peculiar temporal dislocation experienced by Nietzsche's director. This brings us back to the hybrid genre of the Strugatsky's novel itself, and the way it combines the temporal conventions of two genres, the time-forward ethos of both science fiction and Soviet ideology, together with the time-backward ethos of the Russian fairy tale and of Pushkin's prologue to Ruslan and Lyudmila, whose landscape also permeates the environs of Nichivo. So what the novel seems to suggest in exploring the implications of combining these two opposed rhetorical directions, right? The forward-driving one of slogans like 5 years in 4, and the backward-driving one of making fairy tales come true, is that this contradiction condemns the thinkers who must implement it to the perennial repetition of history without the benefit of hindsight. And, I didn't really come up with a good punchline, but essentially that's it, right? Like this is what Soviet science has accomplished, is the being doomed to repeat history forever, but without actually knowing that that's what's happening because they don't have any hindsight.
Thank you, Rebecca. Our next speaker today is Ross Ufberg, also of Columbia University.
Thanks. I believe the title of my talk as listed is Vladimir Vysotsky, Literary Visitors, two short stories, Literary Visitors, but I really want to talk about one literary visitor in particular, and it's, I think it's fitting that this is the place to talk about it, because the literary visitor in one particular Vysotsky story, Жизнь без сна, Life Without Sleep, that literary visitor, in some sense, is Sinyavsky. So it makes sense to talk about it at this symposium for Kathy. And also, I'm writing my dissertation on Vysotsky, and the sort of very format of my dissertation owes a lot to Kathy's translation and her essay of Strolls with Pushkin. So I'll just preface it with that. The story in question, because most people haven't read it, because it's kind of hard to read, and it was never published during Vysotsky's lifetime, is Жизнь без сна, also known as О психах и дельфинах, so about dolphins and psychos, or Life Without Sleep. And it takes place in an insane asylum. The narrator is a patient there. And there's sort of two alternating, two threads that run throughout the story. One is you get this sort of cacophony of psychotic voices. You get perverted nursery rhymes, you get literary allusions that are elusive but also perplexing. You get shouts from patients to doctors, shouts about injections, shouts about fears of impotence, shouts about collapsed veins, and you never really know who is shouting. It's sort of, it's this reported speech that doesn't belong to anybody in particular, and you don't even know if it's the narrator himself or if it's those who surround him. And at times the narrator makes clear that he's talking about, so to give, there's a funny example where the narrator talks about, quotes a letter that a sort of disgruntled patient had written, and I'll read you a little bit of it. The patient is claiming that he doesn't belong in the insane asylum, and I'll give you my translation of it. I, the undersigned Slavic Samuel Yakovlevich, an Armenian by nationality, right? I mean, what Slavic is an Armenian? Goes on to describe sort of his normalities, right? His blood pressure is always correct, and his ESR, it's a medical reading, is always X amount of megahertz around, and his urine is always purple, he claims, and he has no pretensions. So the letter's signed Soloveitchik, and then the narrator says, well, maybe I'm sort of Soloveitchik, maybe that's sort of me, but it's really a different person. So you just really don't know at any point who's talking. That's one narrative. And then the next narrative, the other thread is, very sort of, it's hard to say definitely anything about this story, but the other narrative, it seems like a patient is telling a story. And in this story, there is a professor who's the head of an oceanarium. And one day, a dolphin walks into the guy's office and basically demands that people stop doing experiments on them, that these humans are being cruel, and I'll read you a passage specifically that gets into it. But in this alternative thread, the dolphin walks into the office, says, basically, I'll give you guys 3 days. Tell your subordinate scientists they have to stop experimenting on us. We can actually read your mind. And if you don't stop, I'm going to bring all the, they're called, anybody here at animal person, cetaceans or cetaceans? Okay, don't know how to pronounce it, but cetaceans, which are like whales and dolphins, I don't know, big swimming things that aren't necessarily fish. I'm going to call them all here, right? And they're going to liberate the insane asylum, and we're going to basically obliterate you. And at the end of the story, there's an epilogue, and the epilogue. And we're sort of given to understand that the narrator is in the psychiatric ward because he's a very heavy drinker. Right? And I'll get into the historical context of this in a minute. But so at the end of the story, but in a separate, it's not part of it's very consciously tacked on, and it's called an epilogue. The dolphins come back. They don't end up killing the humans because they're very kind. They don't end up killing the scientists, and they They free the psychiatric patients, and the psychiatric patients sort of raise a glass, and they're able to drink again, which is their biggest cause for celebration. So it's a really strange story. And it's full of allusions, but it's also, it's full of allusions to this sort of, fits in some way to the sort of tradition of, the literature of the mad. It is also in some ways a sci-fi story. And why I think it's important to talk about Sanyavsky here. So the story was written in 1968, and I was in Russia at the Vysotsky Museum, and I was once a month, I think, although I don't know if she's still doing it now, Ludmila Abramova, who was Vysotsky's second wife, leads a tour of the Vysotsky Museum. And I will tell you, it's a great tour, but you better eat breakfast, because she'll talk for like 5 hours. And you go from room to room, and there's no sort of end. But you get a lot out of it. And so I, took the tour, and then I talked to her afterwards, and I wanted to know context about this story, because there's really very little written about it. It's pretty much ignored. When people think of Vysotsky, they think of his songs or his acting on stage or in film. And there's really nothing in English or Russian about it. And a lot of people are dismissive of this story and his other short fiction. And she told me that it was written, Vysotsky was in the hospital after he'd gone on a particularly furious drinking bout. Right, so he was in the hospital, not a mental hospital, a regular hospital, although maybe it's hard to make that distinction back then there. But he's in a regular hospital, and his brother-in-law, so Abramov's brother, brought him a book about dolphins, sort of like the latest science about dolphins. And he read this and was fascinated about it and wrote this story. So that's the immediate context, but keep in mind that in 1961 was when the Soviets passed a law which essentially established insane asylums as a place not just for mental correction, but for social correction. Right, so that was in 1961 that a law was passed. I can't remember. I have the name of the law somewhere. And Vysotsky in 1956 and 57 was studying at Emigre, and his literature teacher there was Sanyavsky. And so Sanyavsky was a teacher, and he was much more to Vysotsky than a teacher. They used to go to Sanyavsky's apartment and put on small concerts, and they used to have readings, and they used to do things that they might not have been allowed to do in the classroom. And Vysotsky was extremely influential Sanyavsky was extremely influential in Vysotsky's whole worldview of literature. Actually, Ludmila Abramova told me, and take this with a grain of salt, but she said, the only person, when it came to literary matters and when it came to Vysotsky's own writing, the only person whose opinion he valued was Sanyavsky's. So that might be hyperbolic, but I think there's something to it, right? This was his mentor, and they were very close. Vysotsky went to visit at both of their peril, Sanyavsky in France after he married Irina in 1969 and was taking trips to Paris. So it's clear that Sanyavsky had a real lasting literary influence on Vysotsky, and actually, I think it was in 1961. Sanyavsky had famously wrote some sort of, whether you want to call it dystopian or sci-fi stories. Most famously, the Icicle, in which a man who has clairvoyant powers, these powers are co-opted by the state. And if you can read Life Without Sleep in a certain way to see how these dolphins with clairvoyant, these dolphins are sort of the man with clairvoyant powers, and in some ways they're refusing to be co-opted by the state, right? They're making a stand against the state. As well, in 66 and 67, that was when Master and Margarita came out. And I'll read you a passage that I think has some resonance, but that came out in shortened form in the journal Moskva, so surely Vysotsky was aware of that, and you also get sort of talking supernatural people. But so let me just give you this is a scene where the dolphin first walks into the doctor's office. So the first time the dolphin rebels. So the dolphin walks in, and the dolphin walks in and says, "Yes, sir?" And the doctor says, "I didn't call you here." The doctor was also pretending. He was trying not to act in the least bit surprised, but it's not easy to fool an intelligent animal though it may be, who has the powers of suspicion. All I said was, "Yes, sir." And then he said, this is the dolphin speaking, "Today, during feeding time, I mean for us dolphins, and also for the other cetacea and whales, one of the oceanarium orderlies, I forget his last name, he gave us rotten fish. And then he said all sorts of unprintable things." The doctor says, "What kind of things did he say?" "I assure you, the absolute apogee, for instance, freeloaders, agents of Tel Aviv, and the peak of the peak, unreasonable creatures." The doctor says, "I'll handle this right away and see that he's disciplined severely." Dolphin says, "Don't worry, he's already been disciplined, but you must ask forgiveness for being the same breed as him, and for sometimes having the gall to use the very same expressions. The public demands it, otherwise there will be consequences." Only here, the aggrieved professor remembered that dolphins have not yet gained speech. They're still a ways from that achievement, and what he didn't immediately realize was this was all just a dream, a result of overwork. Oh Lord, he jabbed himself in the chin with a left hook and lit up a cigar. No need to mention the Lord here. He's had quite enough of our sighs and insults, plus he's sleeping now. Here's his trident. And now the dolphin, with little ceremony, pulled the cigar from the mouth of the overwhelmed professor and lit it, blowing great smoke rings from his mouth at the overwhelmed professor. Yuck, absolutely nasty. The dolphin crushed the cigar. Actually, since he didn't have anything to crush with, he actually did something else, so that the cigar began to hiss and was no more. "And now let's go," squeaked the dolphin in quite a thin little voice, just like when people are The professor expectorated, fiddled with a trident, and stood up. So that's a little excerpt. I think you can see how Voland sort of makes an appearance on these pages. So I guess I'm out of time, but I would like to get into more, but there is certainly resonance with Sanyavsky's short story, The Icicle. I would say definitely influenced Vysotsky's writing of this, and it's an interesting literary attempt, maybe not completely successful, but one that tries really hard to take the context of that he was living in and put it into a short story. And it's an interesting fact that he wrote this about insane asylums in 1968, and in 1971 he himself would be committed to an insane asylum after a drinking binge. So he'd already been in a hospital, but only 3 years after the story he would actually be in an insane asylum and in some ways living out this nightmarish, freakish story. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Rebecca Pyatkevich, Lewis and Clark College, and formerly Columbia University.
I have here a kind of a massive handout.
Can we have one?
I don't think, unfortunately, I think I didn't quite make enough. There's 35 copies there, and I think we
Okay,
probably have
we'll
about
share.
45 in the room. So while that's going around, let me situate for you what I'm doing. So the poems that are in front of you are kind of a small sample of the raw material of what I've collected for my project. And even though there's 8 different, very complex poems on that page, it's still just a very small sample of what I'm talking about. And I'll also tell you how I came to this topic. And I came to it about 2 years ago, a little bit more, about 2 years ago and about a month. And I was preparing for a paper for ACLA on Loseff and Brodsky and Petersburg, and so I was rereading Loseff. And this was also exactly the time when Putin's invasion of Crimea was happening, so I had Loseff in one hand, my computer in the other, and the TV on kind of in the background because I kind of felt like I had to write this paper, but I also had to kind of keep abreast of what was happening. And as eventually I kind of realized that what I was seeing on the screen whenever I happened to look up and what I was listening to was very, very similar, unnervingly similar to what I was seeing on the page, complete with tanks and firearms and things. And this seemed very, very strange to me for various reasons. One of which is that Loseff is already kind of a strange figure in terms of emigre literature. Because although he was an active member of the unofficial poetic circles in Leningrad in the 1960s, he holds the interesting distinction of only becoming a poet, or at least a published poet, after his emigration. Moreover, his highly elusive, philologically rich verse already limits the number of potential readers, and even more so, he was quite limited in the 80s by the fact that he was only published in emigre journals. And although the poems did make their way back to the Russian poetic mainstream starting in the 1990s and forwards into the 2000s, Loseff, his one visit back to Russia notwithstanding, insisted on his status as a poet writing from abroad. So presumably, in spite of a strong nostalgic note in his poetry, he came to find something valuable about that position of the emigre writer. So I thought I should take a closer look at this. And indeed, Loseff's consistently aggressive, if also consistently ironic imagery raises broader problems about the role of the emigre poet and the role of emigre literature more generally. So once I started looking at these military texts, I saw that they fall into several different categories. There's kind of a comparison of the poet and the military man, or the man in power. There's an engagement with current affairs through the poetic tradition of the war poem, a turn to Russia's colonial history in the Caucasus, and its treatment in Russian literature as a complicated metaphor for the multicultural nature of the Russian literary heritage, and thus the poet's place at the vanguard of such linguistic and literary developments. The idea of the poetic enterprise and the military enterprise being similar is present in several important poems, but the comparison always seems to point to the circumspect nature of the poet's power. In Chudesny Descent, which is number 2 on your handout, an angelic military force descends to rescue not just Loseff, but several of his fellow poets from Leningrad. But the takeover is temporary, and while the poets escape abroad, the Angelskaya Rota cannot stand up to the drabness of everyday Leningrad life. Although the poem clearly paints poets as allies of the angels, it is interesting for suggesting that any poetic victory is temporary. Similarly circumspect is Rota Erota, which is number 3 on your handout. Right?
Never number.
2 doesn't have a number?
It's here, but no number.
Oh, well, it's not numbered. So similarly circumspect is Rota Erota, which shows the lyrical eye as a youth in the army. And whereas the rest of the platoon pursues erotic adventures, in fact, the lyrical hero does so only through his words. I mean, he seems to be armed with Song of Songs, but that doesn't seem to help him. Right, like his words don't reach their target, and maybe a little bit more obviously in Ultimatum, which is number 1, you have a more direct and aggressive picture, kind of towards the. I don't think I grabbed a handout, but is it the third stanza? What stanza? Sorry. Да. The fourth stanza. Нет. Спасибо. Right. So in the fourth stanza, the poet bemoans how ineffective his poems are, right? Моих стихов узор чугунный, прозрачный сумрак, блеск безлунный, все это вроде ничего. But he daydreams of the poet taking on the power of the commander-in-chief. Смирив свой мирный норов, пошлю воинственную рать, чтобы это дело отобрать. Talking of Petersburg. The poem balances on the aggressive claim for power and undermining of that claim. Even as Loseff discounts his own power as a poet, the citation from Pushkin, really the appropriation of Pushkin's lines into Loseff's own, стихов узор чугунный, прозрачный сумрак, блеск безлунный, right, executes the very task he claims he needs the greater power of the commander-in-chief to do. The fact that this poet-in-chief then morphs into a cat content to either meow or stay silent at the poem's end, может что-то промурлычу, а может лучше промолчу, further complicates the aggressive stance. The poem Офицер, which is number 6, which is on the back, is similar, and we'll come back to it, talk about it now, and we'll come back to it in a minute. But Офицер, the poet compares himself to an officer commanding a Kirillovskaya rать. Also makes the question of a poet as a commander of military power. It makes that equation explicit. And in this poem, as in the above examples, the ironic turn, here it's in the dark quotation from Pushkin, and the reference to the small number of soldiers in the general's troops deflates and problematizes any easy or really successful reading of the poet's enterprise, right? That is interesting, but it's not the only thing that we find. If we look at Valerik, which is number 4, and goes on to the next, it's on the first page, but goes on to the next page, right? It's long, but not as long as its predecessor poem, which is by Lermontov. But Valerik is set during the Afghan War, but in reality it's a poetic dialogue with Lermontov, who has a poem, Valerik, right? I think that's where the stress is. Is it?
Rhyme.
Yeah, okay.
Reread it.
Yeah, but Lermontov has this poem, but also he references Pushkin and Brodsky as well. So Lermontov's long narrative poem leads after some glorification of military life and orientalizing of the Chechen opponents to an explanation of the poem's title as Rechka Smerti. In his Valerik, Loseff updates the conflict to Afghanistan and mimics Lermontov's down-to-earth style. Obviously, I'm not going to do a full analysis here, but on one level, it is possible to read this poem as the poet's engagement with current events, an exploration of the problems of war, just as referencing just that war is a Rechka Smerti, right? Similarly, Песня десантного полка, which is number 3, right above it. It's not clear from the words from the poem itself, but in his book of essays, Meander, Loseff associates that poem with the Chechen conflict. And it can be read on that level as well as referencing a poet's response to a real conflict. However, the ironic reference to Horace opposite the horror of the death being described and the abandonment by the main base allows a meta-literary reading, one where the exiled poet feels abandoned by his country. Whoa. Okay. Valerik points to another aspect, the reference to texts about Caucasus and military interventions there. The Caucasus' theme raises the issue of Russia and Russian language as a colonial power. In the aforementioned Офицер, number 6 again, Loseff suggests that the theme is productive. Стихотворствую по-кавказски внахлест скалопа на скаку. In Krov, he unpacks the cultural predisposition to conquest as a necessary component of Russian cultural self-understanding, in which conquest purifies and ennobles. Входит война в генетический код кодексом чести. And then at the bottom, наша сивуха, пройдя Змеевич военно-грузинский, облагородилась, стала навек Божьей росинкой. Read in conjunction with Loseff's other poems about the productive mixing of blood and cultural heritages essential to Russian linguistic and cultural production. In particular, I'm thinking of a poem PVO, which is Loseff's version of Песнь вещему Олегу. Loseff justifies the colonializing theme as central to Russian poetry as its secret multicultural spring. Perhaps more importantly, he also, in my mind, here executes a creative maneuver. He uses the poetic theme of the Russian colonial enterprise in the Caucasus as a metaphor for his own would-be colonialization, not only of his former home, which is what he does in Ultimatum, but new frontiers. In other words, Loseff here uses the work of Tolstoy, Pushkin, Lermontov, Sluchevsky as somehow suggestive of his own poetic takeovers. In some cases, as in his own Kafkaski Plennik, which you don't have in the handout because it's very long, Loseff creates a pastiche where the works of his precursors on the theme are alternately reworked, mocked, or inserted verbatim into Loseff's own verse to serve his own conclusions. In others, as in number 7, which Loseff announces his own military project, I'm wrapping up, as unabashedly, if somewhat ironically, colonializing. The apocalyptic истребитель with his bazooka, having conquered the East, will now conquer the new Western Front. Он поработал уже на Восточном фронте, теперь на Западном жди перемен. And then there's this number, the 8 is kind of phantasmagorical, right? You have some tanks going. They don't know where, and they're run by Pushkin and Gogol. Right? So the imagery is there all the time, and it raises some interesting questions, right? About co-opting the colonial language for the Emigre project. Yeah. I'll stop there. How about that? Thank you.
Rebecca. Okay, now our last speaker today, Arlene Forman of Oberlin College.
I also would like to thank Harriman for funding this event, and specifically Liza Knapp for convincing me to come. And my remarks are part memoir, some translations done on a project we're working on, and I'll show you my co-author at the end, to translate Bella Ulanovskaya's prose into English. So, this is Bella 2000, before she was diagnosed with her illness, and the topic is Of Wolves and Women in Writing, the Creative World of Bella Ulanovskaya. When I first met Kathy in 1973, I quickly learned that she was a force to be reckoned with. A person of rare generosity, Kathy possessed an energy, originality, and penetrating intellect that have challenged and inspired me ever since. In Kathy, I found a friend of uncommon devotion, a partner in crime whose unswerving support would fuel my earliest efforts in the field. During Kathy's final semester at Pembroke, my first as a graduate student at Brown, we took a poetry seminar from the late Sam Driver, who, if memory serves, was also a Columbia PhD. Despite the established wisdom of the time that aspiring scholars should devote themselves heart and soul to the study of the classics, Sam modeled a somewhat different approach. In that seminar, we saw that one could study and perhaps even meet a living author. Driver loved to quote Akhmatova's reaction to his dissertation. Он просто любит мои стихи. And so provided you were well-versed, I repeat, very well-versed in the literary traditions that preceded it, and were also equipped with necessary critical apparatus, an approach to the living seemed possible. Sam's example influenced many of the people in that particular course, which included, among other, Nancy Condi. Here's my shout out. It was with encouragement from Kathy that I ventured into these unknown contemporary waters and penned a review of Tifonov's House on the Embankment for the first issue of Obandis Review. Anybody know the year? 1977, an act that would ultimately open up a new path for me. 2 years later, while doing dissertation research in Leningrad, I made the acquaintance of another articulate, well-read, independent woman, the writer Bella Ulanovskaya. As our friendship grew, I found in Bella another original, a unique literary voice whose joie de vivre, kindness, and sheer drive made me recall Kathy. Of course, there were differences between them. Such insignificant factors as class, religious beliefs, cultural heritage. Hold on, this is typed wrong. Okay. But they shared the rare talent for true empathy, for truly hearing others, and for co-experiencing with them the minute details of their surroundings and their feelings. In Kathy and Bella, I found courageous travelers, spirits unafraid to take the road less traveled. In both cases, this was not a metaphor. From her college days, Bella Ulanovskaya began to explore the villages along the White Sea coast, an area she would traverse primarily on foot, usually alone, at times with her hunting dog. These experiences would inspire stories about life in Russian villages that exhibited none of the nationalist, conservative, and revisionist features found in the writings of Belov or Rasputin or other village prose writers who preceded her. Unlike their sentimentalized mother figures, Ulanovskaya's heroines spend their days living close to nature in solitude and simplicity. One more time. I quote from Bella's story, The Day the Challenger Fell, one of 3 stories Novimir published in 1992, introducing Ulanovskaya to a wider audience. Oh, I skipped a whole quote. Hold on, this was printed wrong. All right. In Albin, I'm just going to plug on since I missed it. So here we are from The Day the Challenger Fell. Although year after year her homestead compresses, first her father's land was taken, then her own plot was cut several times, all the same, her days are full. All the same, she still lives by an agrarian cycle. This is the kind of family I've got. No time for them all. She has only potatoes and onions in the garden and a cat in the house. It's difficult to get Granny off track. Even the wolf that dropped by to hang out a bit near her home couldn't disrupt her work in the garden. I'm digging in the garden. A wolf runs by, but I thought a dog. Then I said, dunno, a dog, a wolf, gray all over. I go out of the garden. Where are you going, I say. It stops and looks at me, then runs to the bathhouse, parks itself on the road by the bathhouse, and just sits. I move towards it, and it runs to the swamp by the fir tree, parks itself, and sits. Stay still, I say. No time to talk to you. I need to dig. When she tells the wolf, go away, no time to talk to you, I need to dig, it's a neighborly conversation. These are the kind of neighbors she has, not talkative women, end of quote. These unconventional neighbors, Granny Nusha and the wolf, treat each other with mutual respect, revealing one of the underlying tenets of Ulanovskaya's poetic world, a place where so-called conventional wisdom, here potential victim should fear potential predator, is repeatedly challenged and found wanting. It also highlights Ulanovskaya's stance on the particulars of each individual, here human and animal. As we shall soon see, Bella devotes the same attention to the vegetable kingdom. In this respect, she proved prescient, a precursor to what would later become known as ecological prose. Sadly, I don't know how to work. So this is us in the 70s, how time fades in Petersburg, and then she's standing here in Vsevolozhsk, same period of time, either late 79 or early 80. Graninyusha is but one of Ulanovskaya's panoply of capable, feisty elders, whom I find more inspiring with every year. These seniors, primarily women, have been able to persevere to meet the challenge of rural life on their own. Though they know nothing of Thoreau, they have lived their lives by many of the precepts he developed during his stay at Walden Pond. Granted, those 2 years would seem pretty insubstantial to Graninyusha or Granisiu or Antonina, Tonya Nema, and the rest of the gang. To be sure, these women do not possess Thoreau's philosophical depth, but he, on the other hand, truly lacks their kindness, their concern for others, and their sincere compassion, traits they have displayed all their lives. The second story in Novy Mir, Wolf Flax, inspired the title of my remarks today. Here, Bella contemplates traditional images of women who write. At a time when Kathy was tolling over Terz as he strolled with Pushkin in Dubrovlak in a prison yard surrounded by barbed wire, Ulanovskaya's narrator, a journalist come to the countryside, contemplates the role of the female writer. Noting that female prose is readily compared with traditional embroidery, the fabric held tight and confined by a hoop, the narrator responds, "I've also taken up traditionally female jobs. Why not work with flax? Here's the kind of thread fit for a narrative fabric, the most ancient and durable, suitable for the vestments of Egyptian kings and sails to discover America. If we're unfurling the sails, it's important to have fine linen sailcloth on hand. What could be better than linen sails to travel the seas of country life? Canvases spread on the grass to bleach will change by themselves. And so let's randomly pull out of the bag whatever sticks out." The narrator decides to examine this conceit on her terms by avoiding simple comparisons. Her examination of the nature of flax eschews the commonplace and cliched. The type of embroidery first brought to mind, fine, even, overlapping stitches neatly combined to form surface decoration, oft-time mimetic representations of house and home, was rejected out of hand. The narrator begins to weave a different narrative fabric that will travel through time and space to explore the variety, durability, and functionality of this material, in both its material and metaphorical incarnations. Ulanovskaya's canvas, a mass of prickly fibers, is composed not from the fine silken strands that become embroidery thread, or the cloth known in English as Holland, but from the short, coarse, more brittle fibers, the tow. The seeming haphazardness of construction is underlined by the word randomly, which becomes a minor refrain in the story. This is the essence of Ulanovskaya's technique in wool flax and elsewhere. Meaning is created through associations, through combinations of seemingly random observations and events. Continuing her rumination, the narrator attempts to uncover flax's quintessential form. Our exemplar is the whiteness of a canvas. From here, it's not far to the whiteness of a whale, or if we've gone this far, to the white sheets of Holland upon which final epistles are written. So there's Moby Dick there, and there's Pushkin, and there's also Mandelstam, but clearly I have no time to unpack any of that. Instead, what I will do is show you our fashion sense. This is now the 90s, and finally this, because one of the masters that she invokes is Levitan, specifically eternal rest, while our narrator is walking. And I will read this and get out. Levitan, I thought that was it. Levitan, I'm from a generation that remembers the hook. Levitan shares the narrator's love of wandering alone in the countryside, as well as the ability to convey the Russian landscape through commonplace motifs unnoticed by previous artists. Ulanovskaya expressly links her style to a master once considered the creator of coarse and unfinished products by referencing Eternal Rest, 1894. Levitan's canvas reveals a basic compositional principle both artists employ. Through combinations of disparate items, they create fresh association. In this case, this is a depiction of the river Udomlya, the very waterway that Ulanovskaya's text navigates. But the church on the shore was one Levitan had encountered on the banks of the Volga. Let me, now that's the Mandelstam, okay. A minute?
Yeah.
Okay. I clearly have other quotes from Bella that I had wanted to read to you, but in general, I stopped at the end to think why I picked these particular fragments out of many stories. And I really do think I chose them today for their meditative quality, which in some way reminded me of the style of A Voice from the Chorus. So, while leafing through Terz's work again, I was surprised to find a quote from Yushina Kenko, who probably at the time I read it, the first time I had no idea who he was and moved on. Kenko's Essays in Idleness, also known in English by the more agrarian title, The Harvest of Leisure, also inspires Ulanovskaya's story, heeding Kenko's counsel. To conclude, I will quote from the 14th century Japanese essayist Kenko Aviators. A certain recluse, I can't recall who, once said, "One not connected to this world is touched only by the change of seasons." Surely you can agree with that. I can agree with Kenko, but also need to emphasize that the life he describes, one with no strong bonds, no lasting effects, is far removed from the lives lived by Andrei Donachevich, by Bela Ulanovskaya, and by Catharine Nepomnyashchy. Of Bella also from the 80s with this young child who is so many years later my co-translator, Boris Roginski.
Thank you. Okay, now we have some time for questions. Yes, question over there. Is there? Yeah, microphone. Yeah.
Question for Professor Ufberg. I was unaware there was a Vysotsky museum. Can you tell us where that is? And also, I was in a Moscow cemetery and I saw his grave, which is alongside a cosmonaut. So it's interesting.
That's it. Well, thanks for calling me professor, first of all. The Vysotsky Museum is on what is it, Taganski, Taganka, where the theater is, and it's on like the second floor of a building. It's not big. I mean, there may be 5 rooms, but with Ludmila Abramova, that takes 5 hours. But it's actually it's really an amazing place because. I mean, as a museum, it's not a remarkable place. I mean, there's costumes he wore for certain films and, the shoes he wore on the set of this movie, right? So it's, I don't know, not a particularly reflective museum, but they have archives. And the archivist there, whose name I'm forgetting, is an unbelievably wonderful woman who will give you hours and hours of her time and also will give you material. I mean, there was stuff that she had many, they weren't copies, but she had many exemplars of, and she was happy to actually give me old newspapers. I mean, things that I could use and that I could take with me. I don't know if you should tell the administration she did that, but it's a great place, and it's it's a really interesting place to visit, and if you do go, it's in the center of Moscow, but you should call ahead and find out if Lyudmila Abramov is giving a tour, because I think it's once a month on Saturdays, and it's like really an experience. And then I forget the second part of the question. Oh, that he was buried next to cosmonauts. Yeah, I mean, as a cultural figure, he's totally fascinating because he both was and he wasn't, the cultural equivalent of a cosmonaut, and he both was and he wasn't the official cultural version of a cosmonaut. I mean, I think he was very conscious. Not I think, for sure he was very conscious, that that he occupied this very privileged position, but also that he had to work to stay in this position. And it's really hard to find a quote that you could characterize as, in contrast to I don't know, say the actions or the writings of Siniavsky, who was pretty clear, but what he's saying, and this story is maybe an example of it. Vysotsky, I almost just called him Dovlata for some reason. Vysotsky, he'll never make a statement outright against the Soviet Union. He came to the States, and there's this amazing, actually Frank Miller turned me on to this great interview Vysotsky gave on 60 Minutes, where the interviewer asked him, "Are you a dissident?" And Vysotsky says, "I'm not a dissident. I believe these are the issues I'm singing about are relevant to every man, and these sort of spiritual yearnings are relevant to everybody." And so he could be buried next to a cosmonaut because he never was explicit in his dissatisfaction, say, with the Soviet Union. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think on that note, it's a little bit question of luck and timing and various other things, perhaps, because
Here's the mic.
just because I think but you could take somebody like Brodsky, who also would never claim to be a dissident, and yet that didn't quite work the same way. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Well, also, I mean, Vysotsky married Marina Vladi in 1969, right? So he had a French passport. But I think Brodsky was tougher. Also, Brodsky was made more enemies just by his, he wasn't a very diplomatic person, and so.
And Vysotsky was?
On 60 Minutes, apparently.
Yeah, no, I don't know if Vysotsky was. I mean, I think Vysotsky did not say the same sort of things that Brodsky would say about empire, right? I mean, so, okay, Brodsky would say, he wouldn't say, when he was still in the Soviet Union, he wouldn't say, "I'm talking about the Soviet Union and this is a crappy empire," but he would make great, sort of very large and looming statements about empire that I think Vysotsky wouldn't make.
Well, nobody knows, why. Well, some people are arrested.
Right,
and
that's also
exiled,
true.
and
Yeah.
others, it's.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I have a friend who once said, "I would like to be this little paper that could make its way through the KGB archive." You can't. And learn every.
Right, yeah.
More questions? Maybe I can ask Arlene then. Are you and Raginsky, do you plan to publish?
We do.
Do you have any concrete plans? Are you close to?
We're close. We have all the stories translated, and we've been through it one more time. We usually do this on the summer. So this summer, it's introduction and out.
Right. And where do you plan to?
Well, I already sent a proposal out to a place that I'm not happy with because 2 years later I've heard nothing.
Oh, okay.
That is my A choice, and it's time for me to go look at my B list.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. Question over there?
A question for Rebecca. The title of that work sort of reminds us back of Vremya Vperёd and the discourse of the first 5-year plan. And I'm wondering, are you aware of whether that was that title and was sort of a throwback, or whether there is a continuous discourse of kind of getting ahead of time that persists after the period of the 5-year plan into the space race period.
Is this on? Does it sound like I'm being microphoned? Okay, good. So, I can't honestly say that I've looked into it closely. This particular paper is a part of a projected chapter of my book on magic that will look at revolutionary fairy tales, and most of the revolutionary fairy tales are from that 1930s, like 1920s, early 30s period, right? And then the Strugatskys kind of do this thing in the 1960s, and it's kind of a return to the genre. And I think part of the impulse behind that, well, who knows, because the Strugatskys are also just themselves, right? So they're doing stuff like this, throughout their career. But I think that discourse, that kind of 5-year plan discourse of collapsing time, receives a real impulse from the space program, right? So you have Sputnik in 57, right? And then there's this just like we're racing, like the race is back on, and it has this like newly futuristic kind of jazzy quality about it, right? So I think in that sense it is a sort of a reprise of that sense of hurry.
That's my guess, is that it's sort of quiet through World War II and probably death of Stalin, and then only maybe 56 does it start to come back. But I wonder if there's something else out there.
Yeah, well, that's my hypothesis. Maxime has an idea.
Football, but the
I just wanted to add that it might be interesting for you to look at this contemporary Russian play called Россия вперед, that written by a young playwright, Valery Pichaykin, and it's actually kind of dystopian play where they consider that after Putin's death, the government decides to turn the clock backwards, so that everything in the play actually happens backwards, going back obviously to the Soviet Union and even further back. And it's very Sorokin because at a certain time each day, for example, they have to go to the bathroom, and the feces goes back into their bodies, and when they eat dinner, the food goes back onto the plate, and so on, so on, so on. But it's like it's just, I think the trajectory from Время вперед to Strugatsky to this one may be interesting to look at together.
For sure. Thanks for the tip.
Any more questions? Yes, here.
I had a question for Ross again, actually. I thought it was interesting you brought up Master and Margarita, because there's an asylum in that book as well, right? It's where all the people that are victims of Voland end up, and the Master's there at Ivan Bezdomny. It seems like it's sort of where they get told the supernatural can't be happening, and sort of they tend to reintegrate them into this kind of rational state. I was just wondering, do you see any connections with the way that Vysotsky is using the kind of asylum as a space?
I hadn't even thought of that until you just said it. So, but yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's worth looking deeper into. Well, it's worth looking deeper into Master Margarita, but I also it would be interesting to know how that's dealt with in the shortened version that was printed in 66 to 67. How that is, what's included in that versus the later version. So I don't know. I don't even. Yeah, I would be interesting to find out.
I think if I remember correctly, the asylum part is the same.
Remain.
The theater is different, because in the version, in the Moscow version, it's Dream of Basoy, but in the actual version that is now, it is a real theater, and they're sitting there. So, yeah. So, but the asylum, I think, is they didn't touch it. It's a nice place. It's like KGB there, or Voland. It's nice.
Yeah.
You feel very comfortable there.
Think that it's worth. I'll check it out.
More questions? Okay, then let's say thank you, our presenters.